The morning of December 15th, 1944, began with silence over the Schnee Eifel. The American gunners of the 106th Infantry Division were half frozen, hunched behind their howitzers near the Belgian border, when the quiet was broken by a single shriek of steel, one that landed several hundred yards behind them. Then another. Then a dozen more. Within seconds, the entire ridge was howling. To the German artillerymen of the 212th, Volksgrenadier Division crouched on the opposite slope, the shelling sounded almost mechanical, inhumanly precise. Each round landed exactly where the last had, every impact separated by perfect half-second intervals, as if some machine rather than men were orchestrating the storm. The German forward observers, veterans of years on the Eastern Front, looked at one another in disbelief. "Kein Lichtblitz," one muttered. No muzzle flash. The Americans were firing from somewhere beyond the ridgeline, unseen. Within 30 seconds, half of their battery positions were engulfed. By the time counter-battery teams triangulated the origin, nothing remained to shoot back at. The American guns had already fallen silent, having completed an entire fire mission before the Germans could even take bearings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For soldiers raised in the tradition of Prussian gunnery, where precision came from the eye, the ear, and the discipline of the crew, this kind of invisible, instantaneous destruction carried a psychological weight that few Luftwaffe strikes ever did. The air raids, for all their terror, announced themselves with engines, with sirens, with seconds of warning. The new American artillery did not. The Germans began calling it Blitz on Himmel, lightning without sky. What they didn't yet understand was that this apparent sorcery came from a revolution not in shells or guns, but in the unseen web of mathematics and electronics guiding them. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had quietly begun integrating a device still experimental only 2 years earlier, a portable radar set capable of tracking shell trajectories in mid-flight. With it, American fire direction centers could not only locate enemy batteries the instant they fired, but correct their own aim before the shell even landed. The effect was staggering. A well-trained German artillery observer could once take between 40 and 90 seconds to detect a hostile gun position through flash spotting and sound ranging. The American radar teams could do it in under 15. To a Wehrmacht command structure, already reeling from Allied air dominance and collapsing supply lines, this was something different, a form of omniscience that no flak battery could deter, no camouflage could deceive. The irony was profound. Same nation whose early war artillery had been ridiculed by German officers as clumsy and naive, those Americans who once rolled their guns into open fields to see what they were shooting at had, by the winter of 1944, built a system so precise that even their observers no longer needed eyes. But to understand how the U.S. Army arrived at that point, how its gunners learned to hit targets they couldn't see, guided by invisible waves instead of the human eye, we have to rewind nearly 3 years to the laboratories and training ranges where mathematics first began to overtake instinct. In the spring of 1941, at the Signal Corps laboratories in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, a handful of physicists were working on a problem that seemed more naval than terrestrial: how to use radar to measure the altitude of aircraft and the velocity of incoming shells. Among them was a young engineer named Robert M. Page, a quiet but methodical man who had already built the first American ship-borne radar capable of tracking airplanes. His new challenge was smaller, stranger. Could radar detect an artillery shell? The answer, at first, was no. Shells were too small, too fast, and their flight paths too brief. But Page and his team discovered that at very short wavelengths, what the British called microwave bands, a shell's curved surface could reflect a pulse clearly enough for a split-second detection. That discovery led to an experimental instrument called the SCR 584, a radar set that could automatically follow a moving target once it was detected. Originally, it was designed to help aim anti-aircraft guns, guiding them against the Luftwaffe's V-1 flying bombs. But even before D-Day, some American artillery officers saw a different use. If radar could track shells through the air, then perhaps it could also track where they came from. The idea wasn't entirely new. The British had experimented with sound ranging since Great War arrays of microphones that calculated a gun's position from the time difference of its firing sound reaching each sensor. But sound was slow, distorted by wind, and imprecise at long range. Radar, by contrast, moved at the speed of light. By mid-1943, engineers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, working alongside radar specialists from the Signal Corps, had begun field testing what they called counter-battery radar. The first model, the SCR 584 adapted for ground use, was bulky, 2 tons of equipment crammed into a trailer but astonishingly accurate. It could locate an enemy gun within 50 yards by tracking the parabolic arc of a single shell. The Germans, who had perfected their own acoustic sound-ranging arrays as early as 1940, initially dismissed reports of this electronic ranging. They believed it impossible for radio waves to detect shells in motion. But on the ground in France, men of the Wehrmacht soon began encountering its results, counter-battery fire so swift that it seemed pre-planned. One German report from the 7th Army dated August 1944 recorded that enemy artillery response is now arriving before the first ranging rounds have completed their fall. Another, from a colonel of the artillery regiment of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, complained that the Americans have developed a means to read our fire like a book. In reality, the Americans were reading it like a graph. Inside a tent, several kilometers behind the lines, radar operators hunched over cathode ray screens watched for the telltale blip of an enemy shell rising through the air. Each echo was plotted on a transparent grid overlay, and a second later, the computer, that is, a human sergeant with a slide rule extrapolated the parabola backwards to the origin point. Within 15 seconds of the first German gun's report, the coordinates were already in the hands of the Fire Direction Center. To Germans, this was unthinkable speed. To the Americans, it was the culmination of a doctrinal shift that had begun years earlier, when Fort Sill's instructors decided that artillerymen should be mathematicians first and gunners second. That doctrine had paid dividends long before radar. By the time of Operation Cobra in July 1944, U.S., artillery could already coordinate entire divisions' worth of guns through the network of fire direction centers, adjusting for weather, temperature, and charge in real time. But radar made those calculations reactive. It meant that even when German guns fired first, as they often did, the Americans could reply before the shells had stopped falling. From the German perspective, this technological leap was both terrifying and humiliating. In their eyes, the Americans had turned artillery into a kind of mechanical omniscience. Reports from the 16th Army during the Ardennes offensive complained that enemy batteries respond in under half a minute regardless of terrain masking. Crews began abandoning positions after a single salvo, convinced that radar could see through hills. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The truth was more mundane yet more effective. Radar didn't see through anything it measured with relentless precision. Each firing solution was cross-checked with topographical data, corrected for altitude, and passed to batteries often miles apart. In many cases, the U.S. gunners themselves never knew exactly where the enemy was. They simply followed orders from a faceless voice, relaying coordinates derived from invisible pulses bouncing off iron. To men trained to prize craftsmanship, the feel of a well-aimed gun, the rhythm of a trained crew, the idea that war could be reduced to electronics was almost sacrilegious. Yet on the receiving end, it felt supernatural. That psychological effect mattered as much as the material one. The Luftwaffe, for all its power, was an enemy one could see, hear, and occasionally evade. The radar-guided artillery had no such courtesy. It struck without preamble, without flash or drone, leaving only the eerie silence between salvos. One captured German artillery lieutenant described the experience to Allied interrogators near Aachen in late 1944. "When the Americans fire, it is like being judged. There is no warning, no error. The sky does not darken. Only the earth moves, and then you are gone." For a generation of German gunners raised on the belief that precision came from discipline and sight, it was a moral defeat as much as a tactical one. And behind that defeat lay the greatest irony of all. The system the Germans now feared had grown, in part, from their own innovations. Before the war, German scientists at Telefunken and Siemens had been pioneers in radio detection technology. The term radar itself, radio detection and ranging, was a bilingual invention, half English, half German. Yet by 1943, Hitler's regime had diverted most of its advanced electronics research toward wonder weapons, jet propulsion, rockets, and guided bombs. Artillery, a branch seen as traditional and well-mastered, was left largely untouched. In contrast, the Americans poured resources into the unseen, the network, the signal, the calculation. The result was a quiet revolution that changed the tempo of battle more decisively than any single new weapon. As snow fell over the Ardennes that December, the men on both sides still believed, at some level, that victory depended on who fired first. But for the first time in military history, radar made that belief obsolete, because now the side that fired first was also the side that revealed itself first, and within 30 seconds, it would be erased. The first radar counter-battery unit deployed in Europe arrived not with fanfare, but packed among crates labelled communications equipment. It belonged to the 602nd Field Artillery Battalion, attached to the 1st U.S. Army during the summer of 1944. Officially, it was listed as a radar observation section. In practice, it was something closer to an oracle. Inside their truck-mounted SCR 584 set, the operators, usually a lieutenant, 2 radar technicians, and an enlisted mathematician, sat before oscilloscopes glowing pale green. When German guns opened up, those screens bloomed with arcs of light that traced the shell's flight. With a practiced hand, the lieutenant would adjust the azimuth dial, locking the antenna on the shell's path. The machine did the rest, feeding distance and bearing data to a plotting board in real time. In the early trials near Saint-Lô, the system seemed almost too fast to believe. German 105mm batteries that had previously managed to fire 3 or 4 rounds, before an American response were now silenced after 1. When word of this capability spread among forward observers, they started marking suspected gun positions simply with the note, "Radar track confirmed," a phrase that soon took on mythic weight. Radar-guided counterfire wasn't just fast, it was precise. American gunners learned to trust the data implicitly. The coordinates were rarely off by more than 20 or 30 yards, even at distances exceeding 10,000. That meant their first salvo could land directly on target, without any ranging fire at all. The Germans, veterans of 1,000 duels of flash and sound, found themselves at a complete disadvantage. The counter-battery war, once a deadly game of patience and observation, became something instantaneous. Lieutenant Heinz Krüger, serving with the 275th Infantry Division during the Normandy campaign, described his first encounter in a post-war memoir written in 1957. "We had just fired our opening rounds when it came. The first American shell landed so perfectly that I thought at first it was one of ours that had exploded early, then another and another. The air was full of sand and dust. We hadn't seen a single muzzle flash. It was as if the sky itself had judged the position." Krüger survived that barrage, but half of his battery didn't. In his notes, he underlined one sentence twice. "They did not even have to see us." This, more than the physical destruction, is what haunted German artillery officers. They had spent their careers perfecting the art of concealment. Camouflage nets woven with leaves, gun pits shaped to match terrain contours, smoke generators masking positions before firing. None of it mattered anymore. Radar, impervious to smoke and darkness, ignored all the tricks honed since Verdun. To understand the psychological collapse this caused, you have to appreciate how central the duel was to artillery identity. In the Wehrmacht, artillery was not merely a supporting arm, it was a contest of minds. The best crews could outthink and outshoot their enemies, reading the landscape and timing the fire like a chess match. Even on the defensive, there was dignity in matching wits across the no-man's land. Radar ended that duel. For the Americans, meanwhile, radar wasn't just about hitting faster, it was about information. Every tracked shell provided data: trajectory, angle, velocity. From these, analysts could estimate not only the location of the German gun, but its type. Heavy howitzer shells followed slower arcs than lighter field guns. Mortars left distinctive radar traces. Within weeks, fire direction centers were learning to identify specific enemy units by their radar signatures alone. At headquarters, officers began compiling what they called signature libraries, rudimentary analog databases of radar returns matched with known German artillery models. By autumn 1944, some radar operators could tell from a single echo whether they were facing a 10.5 centimeter LFH-18 or a heavier 15 centimeter SFH-18. That meant American counter-battery fire wasn't blind retribution anymore. It was tailored. If the radar team detected a medium field gun, they would task divisional artillery for rapid neutralization. If it was a heavy howitzer, core-level 155mm batteries would respond instead. Sometimes, radar even triggered air support P-47 Thunderbolts from nearby fighter bomber groups would receive the grid coordinates before the American guns fired, swooping down on the same data used for artillery computation. To the Germans, this must have looked like coordination on a divine level. Their own communications by late 1944 were a patchwork of damaged lines and jammed radios. The American network, by contrast, functioned as a single organism. Radar provided the eyes, the fire direction center the brain, and the batteries the muscle. It's worth remembering that radar wasn't purely offensive. American units quickly discovered that it could also save lives. By tracking incoming shells in real time, radar crews could compute their impact points seconds before they landed. When those coordinates matched friendly positions, they'd shout into the phone lines, "Take cover! Incoming grid 643! Entire platoons learned to trust those voices. At Bastogne, in December 1944, one such warning saved the command post of the 420th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion. A radar operator named Corporal John Donnelly detected a pattern of incoming shells from an unseen German 88 battery. He calculated their arc, realized they were heading directly toward the battalion's headquarters tent, and screamed into the line, "Duck, now!" The first shell hit the empty space they had vacated seconds earlier. Afterward, Donnelly reportedly muttered, "That's the best math I ever did." Stories like these spread rapidly among the front lines, amplifying the aura of radar as something both scientific and mystical. For German units, the effect was the mirror image. Every firing mission became a gamble. The longer they stayed in position, the greater the odds that radar would detect their shells' arcs. German doctrine had long emphasized Schnellführer, rapid fire and relocation, but by the winter of 1944, radar had shortened the safe window to absurdity. Some batteries fired just one round per tube before shifting location. Others tried simultaneous massed fire, hoping to confuse detection by sheer volume, but that only provided radar with more data points. In January 1945, the German 15th Army issued a grim directive to its artillery units near Aachen. Under no circumstance shall batteries remain in one position after firing more than 3 rounds. It was a desperate order. Constant relocation meant exhaustion, mechanical breakdowns, and chaos in logistics. Horses, pulling limbers bogged down in mud. Trucks failed in the cold. One officer later described his unit's routine as life between shells. The American after-action reports from the same period reflect the contrast. They read almost bureaucratically calm. Radar tracking established on enemy battery at 0543. Fire mission completed at 0546. 2 observed explosions. No further activity. Cold lines on paper that, for the men on the other end, meant annihilation in under 3 minutes. Radar's success also depended on something less glamorous: discipline and infrastructure. The antennas had to be positioned carefully, shielded from debris and interference. The operators needed precise topographical data and calibration against known reference points. In poor weather, heavy snow could disrupt readings, and mountains created blind zones. But even with these limitations, radar so consistently outperformed other methods that it became indispensable. By March 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, radar-guided fire had become the defining instrument of American artillery dominance. During the bombardment preceding Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing near Wessel radar-tracked counter-battery missions neutralized nearly 60% of German guns before the paratroopers even landed. Post-war German analyses confirmed that fewer than 1 in 5 batteries managed to fire more than 2 salvos before being silenced. What made this achievement extraordinary wasn't just the technology itself, but the scale at which it was applied. The Americans deployed radar not as an isolated gadget, but as part of an entire ecosystem of observation and coordination. Forward observers, aerial reconnaissance, sound-ranging teams, and radar stations all fed into the same fire direction centers. That integration was something the Germans could never replicate by 1945. The Reich's scientific talent was divided, its industries fragmented, its lines of communication collapsing under Allied air power. Even the Luftwaffe's vaunted radar network, which once spanned continental Europe, was useless for counter-battery work. It was designed for aircraft detection, not for tracking shells. There were attempts. German engineers experimented with a ground-based radar called Würzburg D for artillery spotting, but it was cumbersome and easily jammed by Allied electronic countermeasures. By the time any operational model appeared, the front lines were already in ruins. For the Americans, meanwhile, radar offered something subtler than tactical advantage. It changed the tempo of thought. The gunners no longer waited for reports or spotted flashes, they reacted to invisible data as if guided by intuition. The battlefield became a realm of abstractions, grids, echoes, timing. War had entered the mathematical age. One fire direction officer, Lieutenant Thomas Cavanaugh of the 78th Infantry Division, wrote in his diary on February 20th, 1945, "It feels strange to kill people we've never seen. You call in the coordinates, the radar confirms the path, and 30 seconds later the earth erupts. You don't even hear their guns, you just erase them." Those words captured both the awe and unease of the new warfare. It was efficient, detached, and eerily impersonal. For German soldiers, the effect was the opposite. It was profoundly personal. They felt hunted, not by men, but by a system that seemed omnipresent. Veterans later recalled that even Luftwaffe bombers did not inspire such fear. A plane could be shot down, avoided, or hidden from. Radar-guided artillery, however, offered no such logic. There was nothing to fight, nothing to outsmart. During interrogations after the war, numerous German officers remarked that radar artillery had a unique psychological dimension. One general from the 11th Panzer Division called it the invisible front. Another described it as more dreadful than bombing, because there was no rhythm, no pattern, only suddenness. American intelligence officers took note of those statements. By 1946, the U.S. Army's post-war reports on radar in field artillery operations cited morale effects as a measurable outcome. Troops under radar-guided bombardment suffered higher rates of desertion and confusion compared to those bombed from the air. The Germans' hatred of it, recorded in letters, field diaries, and POW interviews, stemmed from precisely that powerlessness. They had been taught that survival came from movement, from alertness, from experience. Radar nullified all of that. And therein lies the final irony. The Americans never built radar artillery to terrify anyone. It was born of mathematics, necessity, and the drive to shorten wars by improving accuracy. Yet, in doing so, it stripped away the last human illusion of control. By the time Allied guns opened up along the Rhine in March 1945, the Germans had a phrase for it, whispered in trenches and command posts alike: 30 Sekunden Feuer, 30-second fire. It meant the time between their first shell and their destruction. By April 1945, radar had not just changed how the Allies fought, it had changed how they thought. The technology that began as a secret scientific experiment on the British coast now dictated the tempo of entire campaigns. It was data that moved divisions, not instincts. But every technological revolution leaves behind a trail of ghosts. In the shattered towns of Western Germany, civilians spoke of American guns that found you by listening to the sky. They told stories of barrages that came without warning, without aircraft, without sound until impact. To them, it was sorcery, a mechanical omniscience. In truth, it was mathematics distilled into metal and signal, a process so exact that it seemed supernatural. For the men operating it, however, there was nothing mystical about the parasite work. It was grueling, repetitive, and eerily detached. The radar operators often never saw the devastation they caused. They sat in half-buried trucks or tents, monitoring the oscilloscopes as if playing an endless, deadly game of geometry. One of them, Sergeant Harold M. Brooks of the 175th Field Artillery, later wrote in a 1947 letter to his brother, "You don't think of Germans when you do it. You think of arcs, vectors, timings. You think of getting the trace centered on the screen. When the guns fire back, you feel a dull satisfaction like solving a hard problem. Only later do you realize what the answer meant." That sentence, "what the answer meant," captures the subtle moral fracture that radar introduced to warfare. For the first time in human history, killing could be conducted purely by computation. The man pressing the button did not need to see, or even imagine, his target. The radar-guided artillery duels of 1944–45 were the first step into an era that would burst to 4040s, culminate decades later with missiles guided by radar reflections, drones targeting by signal patterns, and wars fought by screens. But back then, in those final months of the Second World War, the moral reckoning had only just begun. In the waning winter of 1945, the remnants of the German scientific corps tried desperately to understand what was happening. Intercepted reports from the Western Front spoke of American artillery guided by radar. But to most of the officers in the Wehrmacht, it sounded like propaganda. The High Command's signal section, already crippled by shortages, assembled a small investigative team led by Dr. Ernst Kreiper, a physicist who had once worked under GEMA, the firm that designed Germany's early radar for the Luftwaffe. Kreiper knew radar's limitations intimately, and he refused to believe that it could detect something as small and fast as a shell. He requested captured fragments and battlefield reports. Within weeks, he received both. The fragments told him little, but the reports horrified him. Multiple divisions had noted that their gun positions were hit within less than a minute of firing. The American counterfire came even through heavy fog and smoke, and often at night. The only constant was that it followed the first salvo with impossible speed. By March, Kreipe had changed his conclusion. He wrote in a confidential memorandum to the Army Weapons Office, Heereswaffenamt. The enemy evidently employs a type of measuring apparatus, able to track ballistic flight paths directly. The speed and precision of counterfire suggest a radar system optimized for parabolic trajectories. This would explain their uncanny accuracy at night and under concealment. He ended the report with a single line. If true, the implications for our artillery are catastrophic. It was already too late. The Allies were at the Rhine. The German radar network, once the envy of Europe, had collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing and fuel shortages. The few operational Würzburg Riesa stations still functioning were dedicated to air defence, not counter-battery. When Kripe finally proposed repurposing Würzburg sets to track artillery shells, his memo went unanswered. Berlin was burning. While radar dictated the war's outcome on a technical level, its most profound consequences were psychological. Soldiers live by patterns, rhythms of fire, the predictability of danger. Radar destroyed those patterns. Veterans from both sides describe a peculiar emptiness that set in once radar duels became common. For the Germans, the fear was immediate and visceral. For the Americans, it was more abstract, a kind of moral fatigue. In a 1948 debriefing with the U.S. Army Historical Division, Major William E. Grover, who served as a radar officer in the 2nd Armored Division, recalled, "The strangest part was how quiet it became. Once the radar was working, you didn't need spotters, you didn't need ranging, you just waited for a signal trace, then gave a firing order. No yelling, no noise, no adrenaline. Just numbers." He paused, according to the transcript, and added, "It didn't feel like war anymore. It felt like accountancy." That sentiment appeared again and again in veterans' accounts, the dissonance between the mechanical precision of their actions and the very human destruction they caused. To the older gunners, those who had served in North Africa or Italy, this felt unnatural. They missed the directness of aiming by eye, of feeling the recoil, of seeing the target through binoculars. Radar turned the battlefield into a set of coordinates. But the younger men adapted easily. They were born into the age of machines. For them, the radar screen was no more alien than the radio. In that generational divide lay a deeper truth. Technology was changing not just tactics, but perception itself. The war ended, but the lessons of radar-guided artillery did not. In 1946, the U.S. Army's European Theatre Board issued a classified report titled Employment of Radar in Artillery Operations. It was dry reading, but within it lay the seeds of modern warfare. The document concluded, "The effective employment of radar has shortened the response time of artillery counterfire by a factor of 10, while increasing accuracy by an order of magnitude. The psychological impact on enemy personnel is comparable to that of sustained aerial bombardment." That statement would guide doctrine for decades. By 1947, radar sets like the SCR-584 were being upgraded and miniaturized. The new models AN MPQ-2, then AN MPQ-10, became lighter, faster, and more mobile. These were the ancestors of today's Firefinder and Cobra systems. Meanwhile, the British had conducted their own experiments under the name Green Archer. The Canadians, too, developed radar artillery tracking units that would later serve in Korea. But it wasn't just about better targeting, it was about control. For the first time, artillery could be centralized into a digital brain. Fire direction centers no longer relied on voice reports or forward observers. They relied on live radar data transmitted by wire and, eventually, radio link. The battlefield became an information network. In that sense, radar was the real birth of modern command and control warfare. Every missile guidance system, every digital targeting grid, every GPS-based strike that followed decades later, all can trace their lineage to those green glowing radar screens of 1944. And yet, among the veterans who had witnessed its birth, few celebrated it. Lieutenant Kavanagh, whose diary from 1945 recorded the haunting line, "You just erase them," later became an instructor at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In a 1952 lecture to cadets, he told them bluntly, "Technology will make you faster and smarter, but it will also make you colder. Don't ever forget that somewhere those coordinates belong to someone." It was not the kind of lesson found in manuals, but it lingered in the minds of those who heard it. In post-war Germany, radar-guided artillery became a kind of phantom trauma. The soldiers who had survived it spoke of it with the same tone others reserved for air raids or the Eastern Front. In 1954, a West German veterans magazine published an article titled The Invisible Guns. The author, a former artillery officer named Karl-Heinz Wittmann, not to be confused with the tank ace, recalled his final days near the Ruhr. "We were not beaten by numbers, but by precision. We fired and were destroyed before the smoke cleared." The enemy did not need courage, nor even luck. They had mathematics on their side. The phrase, mathematics on their side, became a grim metaphor in post-war discussions of technology. German engineers who had survived the collapse of the Reich scattered across the world. Some went to the United States under Operation Paperclip, others the Soviet Union. Both sides sought their expertise not for radar tracking of aircraft this time, but for the promise of guided missiles. They took with them the memory of radar's cold precision. It would shape their new work in ways they didn't yet understand. The same principle that allowed radar to follow a shell's parabolic path became the basis for tracking rockets. In 1946, when captured V-2 missiles were launched from White Sands, New Mexico, the tracking data came from modified SCR-584 radar sets, the very same design used to silence German artillery a year earlier. The symbolism was stark: German rocketry, tracked by American radar in the desert of a new world. That fusion birthed the next generation of warfare. By the 1950 seconds, radar was guiding not just artillery fire, but anti-aircraft missiles, interceptors, and eventually intercontinental ballistic weapons. The same oscilloscopes that once followed a 105mm shell were now plotting the trajectory of atomic delivery systems. One could argue that the Cold War's entire philosophy of deterrence, instant response, automatic detection, mechanical retaliation was born in those radar vans parked on the hedgerows of Normandy. Every advantage comes at a cost. For the Americans, radar had won the counter-battery war, but it had also distanced them from the battlefield's reality. In 1945, General Omar Bradley remarked in a private staff meeting, "We can win wars faster now, but I wonder if we'll still understand what they mean." That doubt would echo across generations. By the time radar artillery returned to prominence in Korea and later in Vietnam, the soldiers operating it no longer thought of it as revolutionary, it was routine. Yet the same moral distance persisted. The screen replaced the sight. The equation replaced the instinct. Historians later debated whether radar had dehumanized warfare. Some argued that it reduced suffering by shortening conflicts and increasing accuracy. Others saw in it the first step toward wars waged by algorithms rather than conscience. Both were right. Today, modern counter-battery systems like the American AN, TPQ-53, or the European Cobra radar owe their DNA to the humble SCR-584. They operate on the same principle: detect, compute, destroy. Yet the human emotion remains unchanged. Ukrainian soldiers, fighting in Donbass 80 years later, have described Russian counter-battery radar with the same dread their German predecessors once felt about the Americans. "You shoot once, and they answer before you reload," one artilleryman said in 2023. History, it seems, repeats itself in waveforms. The invisible war, the war of detection, precision, and seconds never ended. It merely changed frequencies. In the archives of the U.S. Army's Signal Corps Museum lies a small, faded photograph. It shows 3 men sitting inside a radar van near Aachen in March 1945. One of them is smoking. The others are staring at the radar screen. On the back of the photo, written in pencil, is a single caption: 30 seconds. No explanation, no names, just that. Maybe it referred to the reaction time, the fabled 30-second fire. Maybe it marked the interval between one life and another's end. Either way, those 2 words became the unofficial epitaph of radar's birth. For the Germans, it was the measure of their helplessness. For the Americans, the measure of their progress. And for history, it was the moment when human intuition gave way to machine certainty, when the battlefield, for the first time, became truly invisible. In 1946, during the Nuremberg trials, a German officer being questioned about Allied tactics was asked what he feared most during the final months of the war. He did not mention bombers or tanks or paratroopers. He said, simply, "Your artillery that saw without eyes." That answer has haunted historians ever since, because behind the scientific triumph of radar-guided fire lies a paradox that defines all modern warfare. The more precisely we can destroy, the more abstract destruction becomes. The men who operated those radar vans did not hate their enemy, and the Germans who suffered beneath their shells did not hate the machines, they hated the helplessness they represented. Radar had stripped war of its last illusion, that courage alone could alter fate. In the years after 1945, radar-guided artillery faded quietly from public consciousness. Unlike the atomic bomb, it had no single blinding flash to define it, no moral reckoning etched into history. It existed in reports, in technical manuals, in the fading memories of soldiers who once watched green lines crawl across a cathode screen. But among those who knew, it became legend. In America, radar artillery was remembered as the invisible triumph, an emblem of the nation's ingenuity, the perfect fusion of science and soldiering. The Signal Corps displayed its SCR 584 sets in parades, their dish-like antennas gleaming under peacetime sun. Yet, in the veterans' bars of the late 1942, the stories were darker. An old gunner might lift his glass and say, "We didn't need eyes at the end, the radar saw everything." That sentence carried pride and unease in equal measure. Historians later called radar artillery the quiet revolution, the point where precision replaced bravery as the measure of effectiveness. Before radar, artillery was an art. After radar, it became engineering. The front line had entered the age of calculation, but the myth that surrounded it was not born in laboratories. It was born in the minds of those who faced it. In post-war Germany, the legend of 30-second fire spread through veterans' associations like a whispered curse. It was never formally documented, but countless memoirs and letters refer to it the terrifying efficiency, the sense that one's fate was already computed before the first round was fired. You can trace its echo in the language they used. Ghost guns, fire from nowhere, radar death. To them, the Americans had crossed an invisible line, not of law, but of nature. They had made war mechanical. The German army prided itself on discipline, precision, and skill, but this was something else, something that erased the human contest entirely. During the 1950 seconds, as West Germany rebuilt its Bundeswehr under NATO, some former Wehrmacht officers were asked to write analyses of Allied tactics. Many still carried the memory of radar duels. One, Colonel Hans Lehmann, summarized it with chilling simplicity. "It was the first time I felt obsolete." That sense of obsolescence of the human mind being outpaced by the machine became one of the defining anxieties of the post-war era. Radar-guided artillery had not only reshaped tactics, it had reshaped identity. In the United States, by contrast, radar's role in the European campaign was quietly overshadowed by the atomic narrative. The bomb ended the war, radar had merely made it smarter. Yet in the closed circles of military research, radar's legacy never disappeared. Its principles became the foundation of Cold War defense. Every new tracking system, whether for jets, missiles, or satellites, borrowed its logic. Still, within the artillery community, veterans felt a strange pride tinged with melancholy. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, but they also sensed that the moment had passed almost unnoticed. In 1958, the US Army published a training film titled Eyes Beyond Sight. It dramatized radar's role in Europe with cheerful narration and orchestral music. The men operating the machines looked heroic and calm, but there were no screams, no dust clouds, no human faces, just screens and signals. It was, in a way, the perfect metaphor. The war had been rewritten as data. Most of the scientists who had developed the technology never became famous. There were no parades for the texellation, mathematicians who calibrated trajectories, or the technicians who aligned antennas in the rain. One of them, Dr. Charles Lauritsen of Caltech, who oversaw much of the radar development for the Army, was once asked in 1950 whether he considered radar artillery one of America's greatest wartime achievements. He smiled and said, "It was the most useful thing we built that no one remembers." Perhaps that was fitting. Radar's power lay in invisibility, both on the battlefield and in memory. As the decades passed, the myth grew larger than the truth. Stories spread among historians and enthusiasts. Tales of German batteries vaporized after a single shot, of entire divisions pinned down by radar fire, of Allied operators who could read a shell's identity like a fingerprint. Some were true, some were not. In reality, radar was never omnipotent. It had blind spots, weather limitations, calibration errors. Not every radar-guided strike was perfect, and not every operator was a tensor's genius. But myth rarely cares for accuracy, it feeds on emotion. For the Germans, the myth explained defeat. For the Americans, it justified mastery. Each side needed it, each side shaped it. By the 1982nd, when the last radar artillery veterans gathered for reunions, few could even describe how their machines worked anymore. Technology had marched onto satellites and digital fire control. Yet, when they spoke, their memories remained vivid. The hum of the generator, the flicker of the screen, the tension between silence and destruction. One veteran, interviewed in 1985, was asked what he felt when the radar trace confirmed a target. He thought for a long time, then said, "It felt like holding God's stopwatch." He didn't smile when he said it. Today, radar-guided artillery sits quietly in the background of every modern conflict. Its descendants can track a mortar shell mid-flight, predict impact zones, and return fire before the first explosion echoes. Yet, the moral questions, born in 1944, remain unanswered. Is precision mercy, or simply efficiency? Does accuracy reduce suffering, or only make destruction cleaner? The men who fought under 30-second fire would likely say this: it depends on which side of the signal you stand. The Germans saw in it the end of human agency. The Americans saw the triumph of reason. History saw the beginning of a new kind of war, one where the mind, not the eye, decided life and death. In the closing frames of a 1945 Signal Corps film, the camera pans slowly over an empty field somewhere near the Rhine. The narrator says, "Here, our radar found the last of the enemy guns. There is no wreckage in view, only a mist rising from the grass. It is an oddly beautiful shot, quiet, almost reverent. Somewhere beneath that mist once stood a German battery that never even saw its enemy." Somewhere nearby, an American radar operator recorded the trace, called the coordinates, and moved on. That's how the war ended for them: unseen, unheard, precise. The myth of 30-second fire endures not because it glorified technology, but because it revealed something deeper about humanity. Our endless pursuit to make war faster, smarter, cleaner, and our equal inability to make it less tragic. Radar didn't just change how we fought, it changed what we believed could be known. And once knowledge became instant, mercy had to race to keep up. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.